Welcome back. We got another book to talk about today. If you can tell, I'm excited to talk about this one. It's another book from Dostoyevsky, this time Notes from Underground. I actually just finished reading it, and it's nice when it works out that way where I can turn on the camera and talk about a book right after I finish reading it, get my initial thoughts out. I believe that Dostoyevsky may be my favorite author, and this book really helped to cement that. This is a much shorter read compared to Crime and Punishment or the Brothers Karamazov, but it still packs a punch. And so let's get into it and talk about the psychological themes that are present throughout the book and a bit about the plot. I hope that if you haven't read this book yet, that you'll take my advice or my recommendation and read it for yourself. It's a great read. So it starts off, we get this view of the author, this underground man. And the underground, as he defines it, is this metaphorical place or state of being. And it's where people who essentially lack the courage to fulfill their potential retreat to. They retreat to this underground space, and they kind of stay there and they brood and they kind of sit in this turmoil that they develop over time for themselves. It's this kind of sick darkness that they're remaining in, and it's this space that they find solace in, even if they get this twisted sense of pleasure out of it, despite the despair that they're feeling. And this underground existence becomes a defining part of their identity. It's their pain and their dysfunction, and they turn it into something that they cling to or even cherish in a twisted way. And it's as though it's a badge of authenticity to them, that they take this and they slowly morph it into something that they try to convince themselves that they're proud of in a sort of way. But really lying at the root of all of it is this fear to be authentic, this fear to put their true self out into the world and risk judgment by others, risk being turned down by others. So they try to convince themselves that they don't actually care about anything or anyone else. This may sound familiar to you. Maybe you've said it before yourself, or you've certainly heard other people say this or present themselves in this way, that they don't care, they're above it all, when deep down they really care a lot, so much that they're existing in this underground and twisting and turning and gnashing their teeth in this turmoil all the while. So this underground man exemplifies this phenomenon. He openly admits to his awareness of his potential and of what he could be if he chose to rise above his own weaknesses. However, he rejects the effort that it would take to climb out of this pit, this underground pit that he's created and cultivated for himself, preferring instead to remain immersed in this darkness. And this deliberate choice is not entirely passive. It's almost creative in a sort of nature. So the first part of the book starts out seeming really dark, and it forces us to confront the uncomfortable truths about this sort of human condition that we're all tempted to in some degree or another. And it asks us whether we too are sometimes complicit in our own stagnation. The book really comes back around to this full circle, which we'll talk about towards the end of the video. And this underground man's story, it's somewhat of a mirror for the reader. I think that's part of the reason that he's just referred to as the underground man. He's not so personified as some particular separate character. It's almost asking you, how much of yourself can you put into his shoes? How much of his situation and his plight, his reasoning and justification for things do you see within yourself, either past or present? So the first part of the book ends, and then we get into the second part of the book, this apropos of the wet snow. And we start to see that this darkness and this kind of this murkiness that's presented in the first part of the book starts to take on a lighter note, as even we as the reader start to see beyond this facade and see that this is not some scary, brooding, intense, meaningful character. This is just a weak man who is too afraid to confront his own inadequacies, so much so that he projects all of this fear and all of this lack of self-discipline onto others, convincing himself as much as he is able that he doesn't care about the opinions of others. He doesn't care about any of these external sources of validation. But we see, as we move on to the second part of the book, how much he really does care about these sorts of things. And the book had me cracking up as I'm reading it. Like actually laughing while reading, which sounds like the sort of thing where someone says, LOL, and really it was just kind of like they exhaled through their nose, like sort of thing, which would be typical if I thought a book was funny. But this is one of the only books where I'm actually reading it, and as I'm turning the page, I'm actually like laughing to myself. So it's just genuinely funny how he presents this, because there's an element of truth to it, and there's a pathetic nature to the way that this underground man conducts himself. So he at one point describes how if he could just essentially be seen by someone else, this is what he really wants. He notices this man at the bar, essentially, this billiards bar, and how he walks through the crowd and it seems like everyone just kind of parts way for him, this other guy that he's been watching and brooding over in this pathetic way. And he essentially, in more words than this, but essentially just wishes that he could have that same sense of presence, that people would recognize him, would perhaps even move out of his way if he were to walk through a room. So he starts to fantasize, and you see that this is a theme that continues to come up throughout the book. You realize that this underground man constantly lives in these fantasies of trying to convince himself that he is the person in his own fantasies, and trying to convince himself that he would conduct himself in the way that he does in these fantasies. But he doesn't have the backbone for it. So he fantasizes about getting in the way of this other guy that people tend to move out of the way of. And just in making sure that he gets in his way and that he does not yield to him. And he just continually broods over this idea that he's going to get in his way, and he may even bump shoulders with him. He goes on and on. It's quite hilarious. And he just cannot bring himself to do it. He gets himself so up in arms. He starts to overthink every aspect of it. Well, if I were to do this, it might cause a scene. And if it causes a scene, I'd want to be dressed appropriately. So he spends all this time and money that he doesn't really even have trying to dress himself up in a particular way so that he'll look good when he gets in this guy's way, and even bumps shoulders with him and all this. And he continually puts himself in the situation where he could potentially carry this out. And at the last moment, he always just chickens out. He just can't bring himself to do it. It goes on to tell of a time where he goes out with some other guys that he grew up with, and they're all going out to dinner. At this point, they're not even really inviting him to this dinner, probably because he's made such an ass of himself to them so many times. He's so caught up in this idea that he's so intellectual that he thinks that people should yield to him in more respects than just the physical respect of getting out of his way, but that they should have some reverence for him. But he doesn't know how to interact socially, and he's constantly trying to have this holier than thou type of energy when the people around him, despite his fantasy that he's putting up this facade that they can't see through, they indeed do see through it, and they see that he's weak of character. He has no self-discipline, and he can barely conduct himself, much less be worthy of like the praise of others. So anyways, his friends don't even invite him to this dinner. They're probably sick of him already by this point. Of course, this makes him irate. He invites himself, and they say, well, we're all pitching in this much money. And so he goes out of his way to put himself further in debt to get the money to say, I'm just as well off as all of you. I can come. So he starts to immediately lament over this decision. I should have never said that I was going to come. But instead, he decides that he knows at the end of the day, he'll still go. This is another thing that consistently comes up, and it just drives home this point that he can never stick to his own intentions. So he thinks to himself, I should just not go and show them how little I care. And then he says to himself, but in fact, we know that I will go. And he says, at least I cannot be on time, and certainly I can't be early. He ends up being early. They changed the time an hour later and didn't tell him. So he ends up going an hour early, and he just makes a fool of himself at the dinner, and he is so weary of them not respecting him that he makes it essentially impossible for them to do so. He just, like I said, makes an ass of himself, really estranges himself, and they continue on having a good time despite him, as if he doesn't really matter, which is what bothers him the most. So he's just pacing back and forth while they're drinking and having a good time, and it's just sad. They decide to go somewhere after this dinner that sounds like a sort of brothel perhaps, and he invites himself again, borrows more money to go, and tags along after them, trailing behind them. Well, they don't even go here. It's like they led him astray, so he ends up being the only one to go. So he's here in this brothel sort of establishment, and this is when a new character in the book enters, and I really want to talk about this because it's so rich. This young lady named Liza walks in, presumably sort of prostitute for this establishment, but you get the sense that she hasn't worked there long, or maybe she's brand new to this whole situation. And the setting, which I think is important here, is dark. Like, it's literally dark at this point. It's the middle of the night and there's only one candle it describes lighting up this room. So there's a sense of what he's always trying to achieve, right? He's always trying to hide behind this facade that he's putting up for himself. He wants to control everyone else's view of him. He wants to be something that he knows deep down he isn't. But in this setting, it's literally dark. So he's hiding in that darkness. And it's at this point in the story that we finally get some authenticity from him. That he finally, in this darkness, as the candle literally goes out and it becomes truly dark, opens up to this girl, Liza, and tells her how he feels about her plight, and warns her to get out of it before she goes too far, that she'll never make it back out of this situation, and that she'll end up destitute with no one to love her, and that she'll eventually die of pneumonia and no one will visit her grave. And as he goes on and tells her his honest opinion, his honest thoughts, and his honest worries for her situation in this section of the book, we see that he's actually quite intelligent in some ways, and indeed does have the ability to be authentic, to actually share his concerns and share his care for other people. But as soon as he finishes this, and Liza is in tears, he immediately starts to backpedal, realizing that he's opened himself up to criticism, that he's vulnerable in this situation. And he immediately wants to tell himself and convince himself that he hates her, and he only said this to bring her down and to gain some sort of power over her. But before he leaves, he gives her his address and says, come to me. And immediately upon her returning home, he starts to lament this idea that he even gave her address and he doesn't even want her to show up and all of this. So every day he worries about what would happen if she actually showed up and she saw the state of affairs that he's living in, if she saw his apartment and his worn out furniture and his tattered clothes. And this is when we get even more detail of his servant that lives with him. And he goes on describing how he just loathes this servant, that he practically does nothing for him just for these seven rubles a month that he pays him. And he talks about how to get some sense of power, some sense of authority over someone else, he would withhold this servant's 7 rubles a month, withhold his wages, and he would try to do it for as long as possible, but that his servant would just employ these tactics, as he called them, these mean tactics, he says, upon him to get his wages on time. And it consisted of nothing more than just him kind of giving him a stare, like, I know what you're doing. And this underground man, this main character, he just cannot stand it. So he actually says that he's tried many times to withhold his wages, but that these tactics he employs, which are wholly mean and unfair, just make it nearly impossible for him to. But this time he's going to do it for sure. He's going to withhold wages not just for a few days, but for 2 weeks, maybe 3, maybe a full month. That he'll show him that he has the power to decide when he gets paid. And so this is when I'm really laughing as I'm reading the story, because it depicts this his servant employing these tactics and upping the ante little by little, which consists of something like staring at him in a particular way, and then he starts sighing audibly for him to hear. And he just can't stand it. He's getting so angry. He starts yelling at him. He says, "Don't walk away from me. What do you want?" And the servant, he won't simply say, "I want to be paid." It's a point of pride for him. So he's yelling at him, "What do you want?" And at that moment, who shows up finally after a few days? Liza does. She comes in. He immediately runs to his room, tries to pretend that she's not there. Of course, she is brought to him by his servant. And she's just like, "You said that I should come. Here I am." He doesn't know what to do. He's so taken aback by the fact that now, unlike the previous scene where it was dark, it is in fact 7 o'clock. It's light. And she can see him as he truly is. And who better than a young woman to really hold a mirror and reflect back on a young man the authenticity of himself, to show him who he really is, and to, in many ways, encourage him to be more than his present self. And she serves this purpose in the story to say, essentially, look, you can't hide from who you really are forever. I see you as you are. And in that moment, he has the opportunity to be authentic once again. She doesn't shun him for being poor, as he says, for his state of affairs. She doesn't. She doesn't come out with anything. She doesn't give him any sly remarks or any faces. She's there. She's being authentic. She expects the same from him. And what does he do in this moment? He trashes her. He takes this opportunity to try to shield himself from being seen as he really is, and just lays into her. Goes on and on and on, drills her. And even then, she gives him an opportunity. She sees through it. She sees that really this is just his own insecurity, and she goes to embrace him, and there's a cut in the story. And you think, maybe there was a moment here, some real, true moment between them. But no, as the story continues, you see that he just lays into her even further. Convinces her to go. And before she goes, he tries to shove money into her hand in a way of really just trying to buy her off and say, "Look, I'm not as poor as you think. I can give you money." And he can't bear to see her even take it because he knows it's wrong. He says, "I didn't do this with my heart. I did it with my head." He gives her the money and he jumps away from the door as he's opened it up for her because he can't bear to look at her. And she walks out into the snow. He immediately starts looking to see if he can see her leaving. He starts calling out for her, but even as he describes it, he says it just quiet enough where she probably can't hear it. He just never fully commits to anything. And he hates this about himself, but he can't admit that to himself. He sees at this point in time, only after a few moments, that when he jumped away from the door so as to not see her leave, that she must have actually thrown the money back into his apartment. She didn't even take it. He, at that point, has this conviction to run after her. And even then, he only runs halfway before turning around and going back home. He never fully commits. And I think that as the story wraps up and he explains that he never saw her again, he never heard of her again, he never had a chance to make that right, that the story tells us you only have a few of these authentic moments in your life, these opportunities to be real, to be true to yourself and to others, and to truly be alive, even if it means you're vulnerable. And then in the final passages of the book, it's turned fully back around on the reader as he says, "At least I committed to this role. At least I know what I am. It is you, the reader, who only half-heartedly even does what I do. It is you who has convinced yourself that in the ways that you are similar to me, you are justified." And who can pull that off so elegantly other than Dostoyevsky? So this Notes from Underground is now one of my favorite books. Such a good read and packed into such a relatively short book. Can't recommend it enough. Hope you've enjoyed this video, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts about the book in the comments down below. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.